Off top, butterflies smell with their feet. Did I do that one before?
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't matter. Play the music.
This is the Domonique Foxworth Show.
All right, welcome to the Domonique Foxworth Show. I'm Domonique Foxworth. That's Charlie Kravitz, as usual. And we are joined by a very special guest, Mr. Best-selling author David Epstein, author of some of the most, impactful, important, at least to me, sports books in modern history. Thank you for joining us, sir.
It's my pleasure, and I only care that they're important to you.
That's good. We're on the same page. It's a good start. That's all I care about, too. All right, we got the Olympics coming up, and I wanted to talk to you about a bunch of different things, including, for those who don't know, he wrote Range and The Sports Gene. They're both books that talk about developing athletes, and the big thesis, I guess, out of Range to make sense for everyone is that generalization is better than specialization, especially early on. And I was wondering how that plays into the Olympic Games and what we can see coming up this summer.
Yeah, well, one of the things I think you'll see is most of the athletes there will have some diversity in their background, which I think is kind of unexpected given the emphasis on specialization in this day and age. But that's the truth. And you'll see some of the countries that have more diversification in sort of their pipelines will punch above their weight. You know, Australia, for example. I mean, I think overall, like the best per capita sports country in the world right now is Norway. So if you look at in the last two Winter Olympics, they've just destroyed every other country. You'll see them in the summer. They might win gold in beach volleyball. They'll have a few of the best runners. And they actually don't allow coaches to like rank kids before age 12, or the coach will get like sanctioned basically. And so some of the countries, unlike the US, which just has our college system gives us a funnel that is a talent funnel that's so much bigger than any other. Like I ran college track, and there's 30 to 40,000 young people are supported in serious training through the college system, which is probably more than the rest of the world combined. So we can have bad systems and still do really well. But for the countries that can't afford that, they have to follow sort of better developmental principles. And so you'll see these sorts of more holistic pipelines in some of those countries that do better, you know, per capita, Netherlands, Norway, Australia, where you have diversification early because we know it has all these kinds of benefits. And that actually ends up increasing both mass participation and elite quality.
Are there things that we should be taking? Because I understand that we have the benefit of having such a big funnel at the top. Are there things that we should be taking as a sports nation to improve in the areas that we are not quite optimized for?
Should, yes. Will, I think that's tricky. You know, when I don't live in New York anymore, but when I last lived there was like a U8 travel soccer team that met across the street from me. And I don't think anyone in the world thinks that 7-year-olds need to travel in a city of 9 million people to find good competition, right? But that's the guy running that league. It's really in his economic interest to lock those kids into, you know, if you're not on the U8 travel team, then you can't be on U9, et cetera, to make the pipeline really exclusive for people who can pay. And so I think there's actually some research coming out on this now that we've shifted in some sports from kind of selecting on talent or potential or what have you to selecting on income, because increasingly you can't participate for very long unless you're paying early on. Like, so we have all these systems that are kind of priming people to peak really early.
Right. And
if you're not doing that, then you even though we know that short-term optimization undermines longer-term development. So I think there are a lot of things we should be doing. I don't think we are doing them. Like in soccer, people say, "Oh, we just don't have our best athletes in soccer." Yeah. We still have way more soccer players than basically any other country. What we don't have is like a street futsal culture. You know, futsal is where you play with a small ball, and you know, kids are playing in other countries on sand, on cobblestones, all this stuff, and it's a really sort of diversified game that anybody can join in, as opposed to like kids learning set plays, you know, when they're 9 years old. So I think we could at least diversify away from some of this pay to play stuff that I think is very limiting.
That's so fascinating. Before the show, I was talking to Domonique specifically about soccer development and how there are obviously a million factors, but one of the big factors in why France has become one of the premier national teams over the last 2 World Cups is that they play 3-on-3, 4-on-4, different surfaces, different styles, and keep it like games and fun for kids all around Paris until the team becomes, like a senior national team. Yeah. But the question I have is actually about the sports that have become global. Mm-hmm. Obviously, soccer is the biggest sport in the world, but basketball has become a global game. And in the US, some of the best players in the NBA now are from around the world. Tennis. America hasn't produced a Grand Slam champion since Andy Roddick, another massive global sport. Do you think that there is something specifically in the pay-to-play thing in the U.S., the fact that tennis is this expensive academy system, soccer is this expensive travel team system, and basketball is becoming something that's more like that with AAU, that is preventing the development of American athletes being exciting and different the way they had been in past generations?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think again that, so I think step one for making a sport good in any country is like marketing the sport and just getting a lot of people playing. You know, it's like tantamount to a lot of people trying a lot of different solutions to a problem, and you're going to get some good things come through. And I think that's the most important thing. And we have that. But I think we squeeze some of that off with some of this pay to play. And, you know, you mentioned these sort of, small-sided games. Like, we know in all this literature about motor learning that forces people to become more creative when they're doing stuff like that. And in France specifically, you know, even for kids that get into that are expected to go to the national team, that are kind of in the top pipeline, they implemented things like times when, you know, small-sided games and times when the coaches aren't allowed to correct everything, you know, so they're trying to kind of balance accelerated development with some of the principles of developing freedom and developing creativity and all these things. So I think it's definitely undermining some of the sports. I mean, tennis, and I think it's particularly acute in America, but if you look at tennis, there's kind of been these phases more recently where you're seeing like the incumbents hanging on forever, which is great because they can stay good when they're older. But I think some of that is that people who are really good and may develop to become some of the top in the world, but aren't quite there, they don't have that much time to hang on because it's so expensive.
Right.
And so I think the countries, again, that do really well per capita follow this model that this brilliant woman who has like helped both the UK and Australia when they were having their Olympics, name's Chelsea War. She described it to me. She called the fast riser, slow baker model. So some people come up and they're like really early matures or whatever, kind of prodigies. And then they're the slow bakers who develop more slowly. And the fast risers, first of all, are where people put all their attention. But those people are easy to recognize typically. But also they're usually just fast biological matures. So when we push selection earlier and earlier, you see this more pronounced what's called relative age effect, where most of the kids selected were just born in the early part of their birth cohort. Because when you're basically 8, that's a big difference in motor development than being, you know, just 7. And so those fast risers, you know, we put a lot of emphasis on that, but the slow bakers end up being usually kind of the serial champions or the people who rise to the highest level. And so the countries that have recognized that, instead of putting all their emphasis on accelerating the fast risers, they put a lot more emphasis on not deselecting other kids so early, like not disadvantaging everyone else so significantly so early that they can't even have a chance to kind of develop.
So your other book, The Sports Gene, talks a bunch about how how genes impact the success that players have. And I've noticed coming off the NBA draft and looking at the projected players for the next 5 years and looking at the NFL draft, they're all kids of athletes. It feels like if your dad didn't play pro sports, your mom was a college something. Is it over for guys like I was, where I just like grew up and like my mom and dad, my dad played high school sports, my mom ain't played no sports. I haven't been an athlete. Is it done for guys like us?
I don't think it's done, but I mean, I think there's a lot going on there, right? Like back when, actually, to add to your point, back when I was at Sports Illustrated, a colleague and I were trying to figure out if your father played a pro sport, what was your chance of getting a college scholarship in a sport, even if it wasn't the same one?
Right.
So it wasn't the same sport, but just and it was like way, way higher than just a randomly selected person. And I think we're seeing, probably for the first time ever, a generation of athletes who may have come from couples who are both really athletic, right? Like there's a lot more opportunity for couples who are clearly both like very high level athletes to have kids now, because women didn't have that much opportunity to develop as athletes in the past, and now they do. And so what takes place in every observable characteristic, so it's like it's like scientists call assortive mating. Like if you look at couples, their aerobic capacity, your ability to move oxygen through your bloodstream when you're exercising hard, will be more similar between people who date or get married than just randomly selected people. Like we select for all sorts of things, whether we can really see them or not, when we decide who to have kids with. And I think that's certainly true for athleticism. And so I think for the first time, we might be seeing, some of the children of extremely athletic couples. But then there's also that aspect of obviously like the cultural emphasis, if the family's interested, the kid wanting to do what their parent does, those sorts of things.
The attributes that matter to succeed in certain sports change over time. Go ahead, Charlie.
I was going to say, there's actually the NBA is the top one of this. 48.8% of NBA players are related to an elite athlete, which is Division I athlete, national team player.
I mean, the NBA is also like unique in that the height matters so much.
Well, that's a huge part.
That's right.
I
was going to say, there's some obvious characteristics.
17.5 for the NFL, 15% for the Major League Baseball, but still numbers are obviously going up. Yeah.
I'm sure if we disaggregated an NBA, it wouldn't be like, we probably wouldn't see, the marathon equally represented because these are bigger people, right? So they have some quality that translates to a whole bunch of different sports.
Sadly, I'm on the wrong side of this argument, but you probably heard probably a month ago, there was like a debate about football players in the NBA or basketball players in the NFL. You can settle this once and for all because I think you are probably the foremost expert on this conversation. Who would be more likely to succeed in the other sport? Don't be scared to tell me that it's basketball because I said it's obviously basketball players.
You said it's obviously basketball players?
It is to me, yeah.
I got to think about this.
So I would say I can lay out my theory while you think through it.
Go for it.
First of all, height. Like height is big guys in football are 6'3" to 6'6", maybe. The height is the first cutoff at that point. And then football players, there are positions in football where you can just be a super athlete and you don't require the same type of coordination and motor skills. You can't in basketball. Like even the guys who we think can't shoot can dribble and shoot much better than everyone else. I just feel like, and then you multiply that by the fact that it is truly a global sport. So it's going to be even more cream of the crop. Like, I hate to admit it, as great of an athlete as I think I am, they're better. I've played sports with basketball players and they are better than us. I don't know.
That's interesting. I mean, I think there's so much variation. Like I'm trying to go through the positions right here. It's like not a lot of NBA players would make a good center, obviously. I mean, center in football.
Right. There probably are no cornerbacks in the NFL. I mean, excuse me, in the NBA. They probably are no cornerbacks. They're too tall to change directions quickly enough.
I will say though, when I used to look at like combine data from the NBA and the NFL, some things did surprise me. Like the highest jumpers every year in the NFL combine jump much higher than the highest jumpers in the NBA. Yeah. They don't necessarily reach as high because they're not as tall, but there's like guys every year in the NFL who have 40 plus inch verticals, and you almost never see that in the NBA, but they're so much taller. I mean, overall, I think you're probably right. That height is a huge advantage. They're obviously incredibly agile. Think about some of those guys like playing wide receiver and stuff like that. I think some of them would be able to slot in fairly quickly. So I think you're probably right, but I think it's like position dependent in a lot of cases too.
Absolutely. I mean, it's fun to talk about. It doesn't really matter. But one of the things that I found in reading some of your books that I find incredibly interesting is like how different bodies, and this is still gene related, different bodies could seem like nearly freakishly abnormal, but they are perfectly suited for the games or the events that they end up participating in. So that first is interesting to me. And then thinking about that through the eyes of all the sports developments and all the different games that we can compete in, I wonder how much like lost potential there is because people don't find their game or people don't find their sport in part because they specialize too early. I'm not sure how to measure that, but I'd love to hear what your thoughts are.
Yeah, no, I think there's a huge amount. And just to go to your basic point, you're talking about this thing, the so-called Big Bang of body types, as the sports scientist who discovered it called it, that in the second half of the 20th century, the body types became like much more peculiar for their niche that they were fitting into. And some of these are really strange, like, and sometimes caused by equipment changes. So in tennis, when you switched from wood to composite or graphite rackets, the rackets suddenly could swing them a lot harder without breaking them. And tennis players' arm spans got longer relative to their height because suddenly it selected for people who had a longer whip, basically. And I do think to this point, it actually makes it even worse to do selection really, really early, because basically the earlier you do selection, the more likely you get the wrong person in the wrong spot. And when you're pushing that, especially before puberty, you're really likely to get the wrong person in the wrong spot, basically. And so I think we should delay that selection as long as possible, because we know now that there are these physical characteristics, some of which are easily visible and some of which are not, that are so important that if you kind of pick wrong you're really diminishing your chances. So you really want to, delaying selection improves what economists call match quality. That's the degree of fit between who you are and what you do. And that turns out to be super important for performance, whether it's sports or your work.
Is there a reason that you see that will help explain like the duration or the longer careers that we're seeing from some of our great athletes?
Yeah, I think there are a number of factors. And some of the great stories in this, I think, are even underappreciated. Like, just to share one that I think you might find interesting. I was thinking back when you mentioned that to the Rio Olympics, when there were these headlines that were like, Phelps faces his toughest opponent, age, because he was 31 and coming back, and he won a gold medal. And totally overlooked was the story of Anthony Irvin, who had won the gold medal in the 50 free, like the sprint event. In 2000, stopped swimming, started smoking, joined a jam band in Brooklyn. 10 years later, decided he was unhealthy and had to start swimming again. Came back and won the gold in the 50 free in 2016 at 35. And I'm like, these things happen. I think there's a number of things going on. I mean, I think some of it is that historically we have this idea of athletes just expiring.
Mm-hmm.
And I think our ideas about how people have to age have been wrong in many cases. But also a lot of athletes are done with their athletic career not because their skills expire. I think it's much more often that someone who is roughly as good and cheaper displaces them. Not that they just got bad.
Right.
And so, or they suffer an injury that's, really devastating. But I think athletes just don't fall off a cliff that way. So if you see in the sports where people don't get kind of displaced in that same way, it's a great paper I was reading a little while ago about a Danish rower who medaled in 5 successive Olympics between age 19 and 40. And you could see in his physiological data, his pulse rate, everyone knows your max pulse rate comes down a bunch as you get older. There's that rule of thumb, 220 minus your age. It's not that accurate, but it's whatever. It's an idea. And so even as that came down, it's like, how's he going to pump enough blood? Well, he kept training and his heart just compensated by making one of the chambers larger so that it just pumped more with each pump since it didn't have as many pumps. And there's all these sorts of compensatory mechanisms you see. Like in baseball, power hitters will reliably start to tail off around 29 is usually their peak. But they'll start to compensate with like better pitch selection as they have more experience, even though they're not as good at some of the other things. And so I think there are all these compensatory mechanisms. A lot of them have to do with perceptual expertise, where you may be slowing down, but you're actually able to seemingly react faster to things because you see them before they're coming.
That pitch selection thing jumps out to me because it's not a true conflict between your two books, but it's one of the ways that I think your books talk to each other, is that the idea that specialization is bad or too early, I get it. But experience is obviously good. So once you find your sport, it probably is, with the exception of like overuse injuries and stuff, it probably is important to get I know I've heard you talk in the past about like how unconscious decoding happens for a great quarterback because as a result of the experience that they've had. So like it's hard to know when it's time to specialize, because there definitely are benefits from getting as many reps as you possibly can doing the thing that you're good at.
Yeah, so this is an interesting point, because I think as rules have become more friendly for quarterback longevity, they should be able to last quite a long time, because their perceptual expertise will not fall off for really, really long time. Obviously if their arm strength falls off, that's one thing, but they can compensate a lot with that with perceptual expertise. And I think where the balance is, because you're right, these are in some ways, right, everyone specializes to some degree or another at some point, but athletes in a big way. I think the tension is, if you think about learning athletic skills, these so-called anticipatory skills, these are things where, a read in football or hitting a fastball, these are things that literally happen too fast for us to actually think and react to them. So, Major League pitch takes 4/10 of a second, and that's half that time takes just a electrical signal to cross your brain and say, I see a ball in flight. Right. So you could tell your kids, we say like, keep your eye on the ball. It's not actually possible. You could tell them to close their eyes when the ball were halfway and it wouldn't make any difference except be maybe psychologically upsetting. But so you have to learn actually how to see things before they happen and be reacting before they happen. And it's a lot in the brain, like learning language. And so people who grow up, to use an analogy, people who grow up multilingual, they actually show a little bit of a delay in some of their vocabulary, for example, and some of their language skills, but that delay goes away. It doesn't persist. And then they have an advantage for learning subsequent languages later on. And that looks very similar to anticipatory skills in sports. So kids that have played multiple attacking sports, this is something where you're having to anticipate a ball or movements of bodies, seem to then, they may be a little slower in any individual sport, but then they seem to have this advantage for picking up new skills going forward. So I think this is balance of building that sort of broad toolbox base that makes you a better learner in the long run. And then obviously you have to focus in and just get a bazillion reps.
As a father of a young child, are you like making sure that your son is learning multiple languages and playing every single sport possible? Or are you just like laid back, cool dad?
Yeah, I mean, I've been delighted to find that I'm not the vicarious living type of dad.
Good.
Because you never really know until it comes along. So Range was me lulling all the other parents into sleep, and now I'm going to make my kid like the Tiger Woods of Bitcoin or something like that.
Well played.
So I think I'm pretty laid back about it. Although the language aspect, I am a little more involved in. So he is going to a Spanish first school because I do think that's like a really valuable thing. And I'm more, instead of any particular sports, I want to make sure he's like physically literate. And so I think even once you're specialized in a sport, you can have more or less movement diversity. And so, I encourage him to do things that are movement diversity, like climb this tree, do that other thing. So that's all I get involved with. Otherwise, I'm going to kind of help him figure out what his interests are.
One of the things that I wanted to ask you a question about is like, I know we're still learning about like the gene editing potential and what genes have which impact. And combine that with just general competitiveness of these countries and these players. How far away are we from people trying to edit genes to make super athletes?
Well, morally, I mean, I think somebody would at least try it. Not that it would be like officially sanctioned, but I think it's tricky in two ways. So the thing that makes the gene editing difficult for certain qualities is that we used to think that there'd be like one gene for this trait or that trait, how tall you are, all this stuff. And it turned out that there's actually this enormous constellation of so genes are the part of your DNA that actually code for the making of proteins. Everything else used to be called junk DNA, but it turns out it's not junk. It's actually this complex interactions of genes and non-genes in your DNA that determine all these traits about you. And so it's like, we may end up learning that every part of your genome is a little bit involved in deciding how tall you are, right? And so, but that makes editing difficult in some ways, right? Because there's not a single target. On the other hand, there are these few extreme cases, some of which I've written about, like the sports gene. The last chapter is about a multiple-time Olympic champion who had this rare gene mutation that caused him to overproduce red blood cells. Mm-hmm. And so he had this incredible oxygen carrying capacity. And like I made a family lineage, and everyone who had the mutation was like an Olympic or world-class skier, and everyone who didn't was recreational. And so there are these kind of cases like that, or another one with like an incredibly, a muscle mutation that caused someone to have an incredible amount of muscle. And we also see it mimicked in certain racing dogs, where you do see a single target that could be edited. And so those are the cases where you say, well, maybe those are the things that people would target. That said, I think there's so many easier and really effective methods of like traditional doping that personally I wouldn't jump over those ones to go to gene editing anytime soon, especially because you can get results, much more quickly with those sorts of things. So I still think that the incentives are more for like traditional types of doping than gene editing so far.
How effective are we at creating clean professional sports and amateur sports, I guess, too?
Well, it depends on the sport. I mean, I would say in the major pro sports, there's like not very effective because I think when you look at surveys, let's say, again, the sport that I competed in at the highest level was track and field. And in that sport, if you look at sort of combination of things like anonymous surveys and also this thing called biological passport, where people get a lot of drug tests over time and it looks at how their blood parameters are changing. And so it may not flag them as doping, but it might say this is kind of suspicious. And if you look at that data and see how many people aren't suspicious enough to get popped, but they look pretty suspicious, it looks to me like probably a third or something like that of the competitors on the world stage are doping. And we're certainly not catching that many. I think the anti-doping hems in how much they can dope, but they can still dope. And that anti-doping is way stricter than in the sports where athletes have unions, right? Because there you can't drug test them 10 times a week.
Right.
And so I think given the incentives that are on the line, given how relatively easy it is to dope, given that in many of the sports, the fans don't even seem to care, right? Like I remember, I think it was Von Miller and Julian Edelman were both Super Bowl MVPs in years they had suspensions and nobody really cared. So there's a lot of incentive and not a lot of disincentive. So I would expect that there's quite a lot of doping.
On that very happy note, we'll let you go, David. Thank you so much. I feel like this interview is going to be very much appreciated by the people who listen and watch, but even more appreciated by me. Thanks for giving me the time to ask you questions that I've always wanted to know the answer to. Thanks so much to David Epstein for joining us. Thank you, Charlie, for everything you always do. And of course, thank you to all the great producers, Brian, Kevin, Serafina, Megan, and Tez. And I love you, Pavel.
This is the Domonique Foxworth Show.